Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this afternoon. I'm Kelly Fitzsimmons with Project Evident, and we're really excited to spend the next bit of time with you all, sharing learning experiences.
Kelly?
Yeah.
Sorry, we still got one more minute.
Sorry.
So
it's a good dry run.
Yeah.
All right, rewind. He could have let me go on a little longer.
All right. We're good, Kelly.
Great. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. We're really thrilled to be here with you all. I'm Kelly Fitzsimmons with Project Evident, and we're going to spend some time this afternoon discussing what it takes to unlock real-time evidence for practitioners with some terrific friends and colleagues in the field. This is part of a series that Project Evident is offering in our Actionable Evidence Initiative that is designed to help us pull back the curtain and get into some real conversation about what it really takes to do this work from technical aspects, from relational aspects, and from a learning and knowledge place. Before we start, love to know who all is joining us today. So my colleague Cedric Charlet is going to post a very quick poll that we would ask you all to participate in. And as he is doing that, I will gladly introduce our guest speakers today here with us, joining the conversation. Pete York with BCT Partners and Erica Van Buren with First Place for Youth. Pete York is a pioneer, an early innovator, a pusher of thinking and ideas. He is a partner at BCT Partners, where he leads their data analysis work. He blends evaluation, social science, and data science in a way that has really helped the field think, and many of the partners that he works with think about applying machine learning, natural language processing, and artificial intelligence to a better understanding and partnership with diverse communities and diverse organizations. And we're really pleased that he is here with us. And I think what you'll hear in this is the strength of a relationship that he and Erica Van Buren have crafted over the years that have parlayed into amazing outcomes for the populations that they serve. Eric is the Chief Innovation Officer at First Place for Youth, headquartered in the Bay Area in California and with affiliates across the country, pushing innovative models for youth aging out of foster care. Erica leads the organization's learning agenda, helps the organization and their partners, including government and other nonprofits, build their capacity, build their understanding. And she is what we like to think of as a constructively dissatisfied leader who's not afraid of the hard questions and keeps pushing herself and her organization forward in pursuit of stronger, better, more meaningful outcomes for the youth and the communities that they're serving. So our plan for the webinar is to share a little bit more about the work at hand that has been spotlighted in a case study that was part of the Actionable Evidence series. I'm going to share a little bit about the Actionable Evidence Initiative itself. Turn to Pete and Erica to hear more about their work. We'll open up for some Q&A facilitated with them and then open up the audience. But here we really do want to explore with you all the mechanics and conditions that allowed for BCT Partners, Pete's shop in First Place, Erica's shop. And we'll also hear a little bit about another group that Pete worked with, Gemma Services, to partner and evaluate their programs and services. They decided on an approach they call precision analytics to create technological models that generate actionable evidence on demand. This case study is available on the Actionable Evidence website, and we would strongly encourage you to visit it and learn more. But with that, Cedric, if you don't mind going to the next slide. Just want to take a quick second here to explain what the Actionable Evidence Initiative is. And we are tremendously grateful to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for their support and foresight in supporting this work. But fundamentally, we are working together to explore ways to improve outcomes for students who are Black, Latinx, or experiencing poverty by promoting more actionable evidence, by exploring what it really takes to make evidence more useful in the hands of practitioners. And that means that it needs to be timely, it needs to be relevant for context, it needs to be credible, not only to experts, but to community members and stakeholders, students who are the experts in their own domain. It needs to be practical, and it needs to be produced equitably with practitioners, students, and families at the center. So it's a little bit of a flip on the typical way we think about evidence building and use. Next slide, Cedric. So just quickly, the components of this initiative have included a growing group that's become a network and deepening community practice that has helped us evolve together a framework for what actionable evidence is. We've commissioned 12 case studies that are available on the website. We've conducted surveys and research with researchers, evaluators, technical assistance providers, practitioners, and funders, and mapped the landscape to understand where the pockets of this type of innovative work occurring. And we're focusing on field building, sharing knowledge, lifting up folks like Erica and Pete for their work and others so that we can better understand together how to partake in this work, how to advance it, how to build and share knowledge, and how to find one another in it. This is what we really think of the next generation of evidence, and we really care about generating, working on stronger outcomes, but what does it really take to get there? Deep commitment to evidence generation and use, constructive dissatisfaction with perhaps some of the ways that we've been building it today, optimistic about the road ahead. And so the framework on the next slide that we produced in community, in this community practice, really highlights 7 key areas, what we think about the tradecraft or the how, agnostic on method. So this is really not about any one particular method over another. It's not about rapid cycle experimentation versus participatory research. Instead, this is really about the how, regardless of which method might be used, so that we're able to work together on behalf of practitioners to help them build and use evidence that, again, is more responsive to the context that they're operating in, really centers the need of community student voices, attends to the systemic and structural conditions. So we think about this as attending to the macro issues as well as the micro issues, is credible and transparent, that it's meaningful, and it's open with regard to how it's being built, what decisions are being made. It's timely. It's going to help practitioners and other key stakeholders make decisions on a more relevant, useful basis. It's accessible and user-centered. And finally, it helps build practitioner capacity to do more of this work themselves over time, or work with next stage technical assistants, researchers, evaluators, so that they're more partners in the work. So we've heard a great deal and seen a great deal about the value of research practice partnerships. In many ways, what we're trying to lift up here is the how, the magic of that works, and the variety of different types of relationships at hand that can help give rise to this work. So with that, I would love to turn it over to Erica Van Buren at First Place for Youth to explain a little bit more of the why of this work for her.
Thank you, Kelly. Well, I'd love to start first by telling you a little bit about First Place for Youth, my professional home, and what really contributed to the creation of the enabling conditions that allowed us to have the partnership with Pete in the first place. So First Place for Youth is both a direct service and advocacy organization. I think that's an important thing to put up front. We provide a stable foundation of housing, and we also provide employment and education services to young people who have either aged out of the foster care system or who have opted into extended foster care. And we have a core program model called the My First Place program model, and that is really where our direct service work is centralized, but we also have advocacy. So our work at My First Place has really helped to inform our policy agenda. I think what makes First Place unique in my experience is that we not only use data and knowledge as a primary program learning and improvement tool, but what's taken us to the next level is that we have also found ways to demonstratively leverage data as a program intervention itself. And what First Place for Youth and BCT Partners developed together is a perfect example of that, I think. So that is one thing that I think has helped to set the foundation for this work. The other thing is that, we've always invested in addressing these core and continuous learning questions. So the first of the questions is, who are we serving? And who is more or less likely to engage in our services in a way that sets them up for success? Number two is, how do we continuously get better at serving young people with different characteristics at the front door, who have different needs and strengths, using a lens toward equitable results for every single youth who comes to us. And then the third one is, how do we get better at integrating and balancing the delivery of interventions and supports with young people as drivers that addresses both the psychosocial wellness and healthy living skills that young people will need and economic self-sufficiency. The existing knowledge base on foster youth hasn't elucidated how supports and interventions in these areas must interact or complement one another in different ways for young people to optimize their chances of leaving extended foster care with sure footing to economic self-sufficiency. We collect a lot of rich program data, and we really wanted to find ways to give it back to our practitioners and in such a way that supported their strategic learning and use of data in service to these questions, and in as close to a real-time fashion as possible, because we find that that is absolutely key. It has to be relevant, it has to be timely. And that could be intentionally applied to the great work that they are doing with young people every day. So in a nutshell, that's really the impetus that led us to develop what we lovingly call the Youth Roadmap to Success tool. And this is a journey that started with Pete way back in 2014. We worked with Pete and his team at BCT Partners to model all of our administrative data and develop a decision support tool that provides recommendations for practice and key milestones that help them gauge progress with young people and ultimately optimize their chances of leaving our program with lifelong earning living wage employment. That's our core result of interest to us. So with that, I'd love to show you what it looks like so you can get a sense of kind of what we've been able to create together. This is a tool that we are now using throughout the state of California. We are one of the largest providers of extended foster care in the state, and we've also begun to do some early stage scaling of this to our network affiliate partners. So if we can bring up that slide. Okay, so this is the Youth Roadmap to Success. This is actually a screenshot of one of the user interface dashboard pages that are used by our practitioners. I want to stress the importance of the fact that what you're looking at right now was developed by practitioners for practitioners. So they were instrumental to the design, to the interpretation of the models through the design and how they're using it. And I think that that's a really important point to emphasize because that's what's made it doable and achievable. What does it give them? So this is a youth-centered dashboard. This gives information on an individual youth. And basically what it's providing is, it is providing recommendations for high impact services that serve as recommendations for that practitioner that they can use with a young person who resembles in characteristics, youth needs and strengths, other youth that we have served in the past and what worked for those youth. And you can see here, you can look at what's been achieved so far, and that can be used with young people to help celebrate achievements and accomplishments. You can also look at what's needed more of with that young person. And if it's a high priority, that means you're going to get better bang for your buck, right? In working with that young person. The other thing that it helps us to understand is, the work of a care manager is very complex. There's a lot of things that they are holding with young people at the same time, a lot of different goals. And the goals themselves that are provided here in the dashboard are really kind of those incremental successive approximations towards the ultimate goal of living wage employment that helps them to gauge where they're making progress and how they're making progress in a way that optimizes, right, where they direct their attention with young people. And so this updates every day. And as they continue to make progress in what services are going to lead to the accomplishment of what goals that increase their likelihood of leaving the program with living wage employment, it is helping us to get really precise about what works with young people and to test out the environment. Okay, well, this didn't work for this young people. Maybe we try something else or we pivot. It really does also provide a great base for conversation. The other thing I'll say before we move to the next slide is we also put information in here that practitioners wanted. So we have the young person's employment status, we have their education status, we have a read on how many weeks they have left to make traction on these service and progress goals. And our practitioners really crafted this with lots of piloting, lots of feedback, lots of testing. Okay, next slide. We also have what we call our regional dashboard. And this is something that our managers can use, our leadership can use, and our staff can use to determine month-to-month progress across sites and across First Place as a whole in achieving service progress and goals progress over time. And this is something that I was really interested in, but our managers are really interested in it too. We can look at outliers by where that young person is in, their stages. We have stages of entry and stabilization and pathway to living wage. The first stage is this gets the young person really ready to engage in what works. So we know what stage they're in, we know how long they've been in program, and this gives us almost like a distribution of who may be ready to transition and who we really need to lean in with. So this is one of the other dashboards that helps us with planning, additional R&D with our program staff, and setting targets that will help us to move increasingly towards impact on this result. So these are two of the dashboards. There's a couple others, but this gives you a little bit of a sense of where we've gone with the tool and what it looks like and what it gives us. Okay, I'm actually going to turn it over to Pete to talk a little bit more about what your part of the process was, Pete, which has been extensive.
That's great. Thank you very much, Erica. So I always like to start off by saying that, in part, there's probably a question of, how did we get involved and get started on this? I think part of it, it's really important to note is that I'm a former social worker, and then a 25-year, I was a frontline worker, caseworker of homeless. I worked inpatient psych with kids for a number of years. And then I became an evaluator after I went to graduate school and learned the tools and trade of social science research. And I became an evaluator for a good 25 years. And the challenge that I had was that, during those times, we were gathering a lot of data and information, and we were generating evidence. And the challenge was I hadn't really experienced that the evidence that we were generating as evaluators was reaching the practitioners that I recall myself and all of my colleagues of my younger years being on the front lines. And so we didn't meet, those insights didn't meet there. It would guide funding decisions, evaluation, and evidence. It would guide policy sometimes. So it has value, an important value. The challenge was that, the idea that how do you deliver data that's insightful and helpful and evidence for practitioners? That's an important background in terms of how we got involved and how I got involved with First Place for Youth. And I know a part of it, Erica, was the piece of the fact that we really had begun to integrate these tools of predictive analytics, machine learning, AI, and ways that we could really enhance what we can do with program administrative data. I know that was a big part of it. I think a part of it really was the fact that we were all anchored, First Place for Youth, and the background that I and my team came with is anchored in that practitioner-centric orientation, and quite frankly, the youth orientation of trying to really bring data to those front lines and how can we help on a case-by-case basis. A lot of the background where I come in is over the past decade is really learning the tools of predictive analytics when you have these certain aha moments and it's totally a sidebar moments where You know, you're watching Netflix and you're going, if they can be this smart about the next recommended movie I should watch, or Amazon's very smart about the next book I should read. And usually if I do get those and I take those recommendations, I know they're effective. You know, I was reading articles and stories about how precision medicine is really advancing, and how, you know, it's on the principle, one size doesn't fit all. How can we bring these tools, these machine learning tools and data science tools, to bridge the gap between the evidence that is population-based that we're generating as evaluators to what really the frontline practitioner needs, and being able to use that and do so in real time. That's the other thing. A lot of evaluation reports were, you know, summative after a long period of time, and it really took, and quite frankly, it had a shelf life, right? Because the data wasn't being updated, the analysis wasn't being updated. One of the other advantages of a lot of the data science and the computer engineering world is that they're using data that continuously updates. That's the other thing. You know, I also knew that one of the big challenges in the sector was that practitioners weren't able to, they're tasked with putting a lot of data, gathering a lot of data, and not lots coming out in return. And we approached, and so we met Erica and the former CEO of First Place for Youth, and it really just connected in the sense that they were in a place where they were very ready, data ready, program ready. I will say there was a lot of readiness to get under as we get started, but they were ready to get started and had already begun looking at data and evaluation and rigorous evaluation, which is another piece where, you know, randomized control trials and trying to figure out where they were ready to get to that next evidence level. But always focused very much in what First Place for Youth at the heart was always focused on the youth and helping each individual equitably achieve the most positive result possible. We're talking about a population, when you think about aging out of foster care, and the other thing is we also had done a lot of work in foster care and juvenile justice. So we'd already done a lot of this work to really understand the nuances and understand and appreciate just how that transition is so pivotal in so many ways to youth as they age out of foster care. And so you start to look at how critical it is in those moments and how critical it is. And so I think that all came together. And I think it was really Erica and Sam, who was the CEO at First Place for Youth at the time. And that was a while ago, 2014. But Erica's leadership in terms of, at the time, I don't know that you were CIO. I think at that time you were, I don't know what the official title was, but you were the evaluation director.
Evaluation and learning, yeah.
Yeah, evaluation and learning. And so that's where it started. The great thing about Erica, and the thing that made First Place for Youth and when we got started, which I will say is the seed, and then we can go into the questions, is really this idea that Erica was an embedded evaluator, if you will, but also somebody who collaborated and already partnered with all of the practitioners and program leaders at First Place for Youth. So evaluation and learning was already integrated into the program learning and the programming. And I think that's really key. If I were to kind of give you three things, I'm going to actually repeat back what Erica was saying, and data as program. I want to emphasize that. The idea that data is as program, I'll add evaluation as program, I'll add evidence generation as program. And it's now possible with the tools of technology. The precision modeling, which is behind this tool, in a very simple nutshell, and you can read more about it in the case study that Kelly it mentioned and is available on a link. It's really about being able to take existing program administrative data. So data that's already being collected. That's the other thing, right? We're all busy. Practitioners don't have time to basically provide, constantly be assessing and new tools and all that stuff. How can we leverage the data that's already being gathered? Okay. So we're talking about finding in history similar youth with similar backgrounds and experiences that make them very likely, and this is the equity issue, they're not going to respond to the program the same way. So it's not one size fits all. So can we find, using the tools of machine learning, can we find patterns of youth and their histories and backgrounds? They share a lot in common. We can look in a data set, in this case, First Place for Youth, and find those cases. Then what we can do is, the great thing about machine learning is algorithms can help also identify the patterns of goals and services that best led to positive outcomes. In this case, we were looking at a living wage. okay, as the ultimate outcome. And so what we were looking at were natural experiments in history of groups of similar youth captured already in the administrative data. So we were using those natural experiments. Why is that important? Because it's real world data happening in real time. That's important because sometimes that really matters. You can do a really effective evaluation, a randomized control trial, but sometimes it's hard to generalize that to all different types of settings afterwards because it's very staged, it's very controlled, randomized controlled trial. This was looking back in history and seeing all the variants that happened at First Place for Youth with each different group of youth and leveraging those differences as if they're natural experiments and learning those patterns. And that's what's behind the tool you see. We'll go in more detail, but those are some of the pieces and some of the great, really the great leadership and readiness factors at a first blush that First Place for Youth. And we were able to bring these two things together, the tools of data science and social science together to get started.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Pete. I just want to interject for a moment and share two quick things. From our quick poll, we understand that we have pretty strong representation from nonprofits, from foundations, from technical assistance providers and researchers, a little bit of representation from government. So we'll work on spreading the word with our government friends going forward. And I will just also remind us, we will do a brief survey at the very end to collect a little bit more information so that we can strengthen our discussions going forward and capture more learning from you all. Pete and Erica, as you all were explaining the work, a few questions did pop up in chat. So I'm going to ask you to weave in responses to those questions as part of a few questions that I do have for you. Those were specifically, there was a question around what the tool actually is, how automated it is. And then secondly, there was a question about Erica with your slides, effect utility they have with funders, both in getting them to see the work differently and understand the value of these approaches and this type of evidence building. So as you think about your responses there for both of you, it is clear there was a meeting of the minds when you came together. And that it was I think that it was a partnership meant to be. You've commented on some of the readiness factors, but machine learning in the social sector is new. And I'm wondering if you both can speak to some of the concerns that arose as you were embarking on this initiative, and maybe the fact that whenever we also think about algorithms, we tend to think about bias. And which is of particular importance, and we're dealing with human subjects. So just wondering if you could address concerns that arose, get us behind the scenes, and then maybe touch a little bit more on how you really dealt with doing your best to strip bias out of the approaches that you were using.
Well, I can start, and then Pete, add on some of the technical things that help to contribute to our ability to reduce bias. So, full disclosure, my former boss was enamored by Pete when he saw him speak at a presentation, and he said, "You're going to work with Pete." And I was like, okay. And I knew nothing about data science. So I want to normalize that for people. I had no idea how it worked. I knew that it was something that was used at Google. I knew that it was something that referenced, for me, in my mind, it was big data. So part of the concern for me was like, are we going to have enough data to do this? Like, is this actually going to be meaningful? Because I'm thinking about it from a traditional evaluation standpoint, right? Where power is deduced by sample sizes. And so we do have a lot of young people we've served in the past that we could leverage, but that was definitely still a concern until I was able to talk to Pete. I think the other concern outside of the bias was around how, at the time we started doing this work with Pete, extended foster care implementation in California was beginning. And what that meant for First Place was that we were moving from being outside of the system to being a provider in the system. And that also had a ripple effect on who was coming into our program, the types of young people who were coming into our program, the types of experiences they had had, the types of needs they had. And our program was not adequately addressing what their needs were. So we had collected all this data on a program model that worked for a subset of our population, but it didn't necessarily reflect where we were trying to go to evolve and adapt. So I was also concerned about to what extent is the modeling actually going to reflect the current like landscape of service delivery for First Place. So Pete, what do you think?
So along those lines, well, that's great. I'll address the latter first, and that is one of the things that addressed the concern that system changes, policy changes could affect, what we're learning in the data when we do the modeling. And that's also where I think there's a readiness that has to be there that understands that the opportunity we have is you can rerun your models. In other words, let's say there's a big system event. You are outside of the system. There were changes made in the state of California that affected the population you served at First Place for Youth. And then as the new data came in, we know we would have to adjust we'd have to retrain the models, if you will. Because at some point, there are big changes that do happen. It's like in criminal justice when a state legalizes marijuana and you're building models to understand, justice factors and other things. It's very similar, okay? So part of the challenge we have in that context is people are like, well, then aren't the models changing all the time? Not necessarily, because all these changes don't take place immediately. So there's an opportunity in this. And what I will say about that is that you can evolve them and really learn with that. Yeah. The other piece around bias I want to step back on a little bit is that, and this is one of the reasons that, and if you look at the mission work of BCT and what we're all about around diversity, equity, inclusion, this was a huge concern from my vantage point, and actually a concern that I'm still very concerned about, which is that if we just run algorithms for predictive accuracy, we're going to be perpetuating all kinds of biases, both research biases and social biases. Because remember, in our world, all of this data oftentimes is reflective of people making decisions and documenting their decisions. But those decisions have been filtered through our social individual lenses and biases. So we're very intentional in the process of doing some key things, like we don't model and match groups based on factors that should not be selection criteria. So in other words, if race or gender should not be a reason why somebody does or does not get a program, then you don't match based on that, okay? And what you do is when you figure out what works for each group, we then evaluate post facto whether different groups of folks, women, minorities, whatever the case may be, are equally getting what works. And so we have a way to actually assess equity, and we're doing a lot of work along those lines. There are a lot of ways I can go in more detail, but transparency is key, not using algorithms that nobody can see what's going on inside, right? So peer review is a principle in the scientific community that needs to be in the data scientific community. If you want to put science after the word data, then peer review and transparency has to be there, okay? And so these are principles we followed. So part of our partnership with First Place for Youth, Erica, Sam, everybody at the beginning of this and other work that we do is we foundationally won't be in the business of like black box algorithms and just dumping every variable in to get the highest accuracy. It's got to have value to explain and learn and not make sure we're perpetuating biases.
Yeah. And Pete, I will say, Pete had me under the hood all the time, right? We had and invited program people under the hood of the algorithms because other perspectives were needed to interpret the data and make it meaningful and elucidate kind of what were the spurious associations and associations that could actually in some cases be harmful, right? For staff and for young people. So, and the other thing I'll say is that we were very, very clear that we were not going to have this be a tool where you had to enter additional information. So to answer one of the questions that came up, the data starts in our performance management system, and we use Apricot, and every day it shoots to our data warehouse, and then it goes through the models. And I'm doing a very elementary explanation of this, Pete, so forgive me. It runs through the models, and then it punts into our business intelligence software, our dashboarding software, Power BI, which is connected to our SharePoint site at First Place. So people can actually go into our portal and easily access this information along with other information. So it doesn't live outside of the existing technical architecture for the organization. And that's a huge change management strategy by design. Make it accessible, make it visible, and integrate it in the way that you can.
And something that's important about what Erica just said is that the use of Power BI, which is a Microsoft data visualization tool, it's very similar to Tableau, or there's some other data visualization software. We tend to use Power BI, but the reason it's so important is because you could always build something as a software application from scratch, but Power BI, what it does is it allows a whole lot of flexibility on the design. And I want to emphasize something Erica said, which is this is practitioner designed. And you also want to be able to redesign, add to, enhance, and iterate. In a human-centered design approach, you're iterating through to make things better and maximizing utilization, maximizing learning, and maximizing benefits of the youth. Okay, so from that standpoint, Power BI was a very good tool to use rather than trying to code this from scratch and then recode every time you wanted to fix something. The tools like Power BI are really great tools to be able to do this, and very inexpensively. Well, I shouldn't say very inexpensively, but the point is there's a cost with all of these tools. It is a normal price for the data visualization space, but it's a great tool because it provides flexibility and the ability to adjust your design and even adapt to include, for example, practice guides and links, and it feels like a website. So it's a very versatile design tool. We picked Power BI because in the work that we do at BCT, there's a lot of organizations that are within a Microsoft environment, and so it becomes easier to integrate it. It's not anything. We've worked with Tableau as well and others, so we're not, it's not one or the other, but it just happened to be in this space as an environment. We usually go with where the client is, and if the client is better to use Power BI, we'll go that route. If they're in a Tableau potential environment, we'll go that route.
Pete and Erica, I'd like to take this opportunity. Let's double click a little bit on capacity and design and implementation. I'm just curious how your initial thinking in design evolved over time in the course of your project. What did you learn about that, and what capacities, Erica, First Place and your stakeholders might also have built as a result of this experience? And I'm also curious, Pete, you made reference to some of the natural experiments, and there is a question about if you could clarify your definition of natural experiments, but I think if you don't mind speaking to that in the course of speaking to design and capacity, that would be great.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I can start and talk to you about how I've seen the arc of evolution of First Place's capacity grow. And I really have to give major propers to the leadership that has really been driving this. I mean, Pete and I have had the vision, but the people who are actually designing and implementing this work have been the heroes in making sure this gets used and making sure that it's effective and feasible. So our Vice President of Evaluation and Learning, Matt Levy, is one of those evaluation practitioners. And I think that there's more and more role for this in the internal evaluation space, is to do human-centered design, to see himself as a change agent, and to engage in change management in a way that allows for this space for program leadership to actually be absorbed into the process. So our VP of Employment and Education, Erica Waterford, and our VP of Programs, Jamie Kugelberg, the three of them are like the trifecta, right? And so they've been the ones to identify and work with managers and direct line staff to concretize the capacity. You know, we've also, so we use it as part of our test and learn approach, but we've hired a data science person who's steering this work forward. We also are constantly using the tool in our improvement committee sessions so that it's used for Plan, Do, Study, Act work. It's actually a tool that we use to test iterations on our model. And I think from the inception to now, what's been, I think, the key ingredient to making all of this relevant is, number one, we strategically got very clear on our outcome, aligned across all of our departments. And that is part of our strategic work, like moving the needle and raising the bar on what we expect for young people in service with them, is to make sure that they have living wage employment that makes it, like, enrolling in college isn't enough. Getting a basic skills job is not enough. We have to be able to support them to be self-sufficient. And so that became our strategic directive. And so this has been embedded fully into the way we think about our mission as an organization. And that's one of the things that we do. We explain to our funders. And by the way, our funders love this. They love this. I think it helps with explaining what our mission is and being demonstrative about this is how one of the many tools that we use to elevate best practice or practice-based evidence, really. I mean, this is practice-based evidence at its finest. And we also use it as a tool to help them understand the complexity of the work. Right? What does it take to achieve an outcome that's long lasting and endurable and makes a real difference in a young person's life? I think that has led to, there's been a lot of great conversations about that. And then I think finally what I'd say is, like, the capacity, what's changed, and this is something I'd love to hear more from you about, Pete, is I think what's changed from we have had two generations of this tool. The first generation looked very different from the second generation. The second generation is far, far superior. I think in part because we developed a logic model with our data to guide the modeling, and that has made it incredibly relevant. It was based on to the way we work, the program theory and the logic. You know, we enter a ton of data every day for the model. And so that's how we get people to enter the data. They're entering it because they're maintaining fidelity to our model. They're documenting outcomes for young people. All of that is used already and entered already and looked at all the time already. So we had to build a logic model for the modeling that supported that enhanced and reinforced it. And I think that was a game changer for us, because now people can connect the dots between what we do, what the expectation for performance is around the model, and what is coming, what are the outputs from this tool.
It's great. So I'll come at this and also jumping from what you were just saying, Erica, and the logic model. And I'm gonna speak like a technologist right now. There's oftentimes we talk in the technology space about the back end and the front end. Okay, so what do we mean? We mean on the back end, think of this like the analytics that are under the hood. Okay, and then there's the front end, which is what the users see and use. Okay, so both of those are important to think about in terms of really effectively designing these. So when we talk about design, and at BCT, and a lot of the work that we've learned is this. So the first version that we just talked about, that Erica just talked about, was at a stage where we were focused on the analytics to get that right, to make sure that we are quasi-experimentally conducting, finding observational studies and data. When I said natural experiments, what I literally mean is in the research community, they use observational data research, over 100,000 studies in the medical, use things like propensity score matching, where you match cases based on the characteristics that make them more or less likely to get a treatment. okay, or experiencing something in their environment. And then what you do once you're in their matched groups, that's controlling for. So you're controlling for factors because we don't have randomized control trials in the real world, observational data, in observational data, I shouldn't say. And so then what we do when the natural experiments is, as you all probably know, especially if any of you have experience with the frontline work as a practitioner, you might have somebody that comes in presenting with a very similar history and background, but they don't always get the same treatment. Why? Well, because, for example, when I was a caseworker for the homeless, there weren't beds available in a substance abuse clinic, in a residential substance abuse place, because there weren't beds available. So in the data, I had some that I was able to, with the same case and history, similar histories, I could refer to a substance abuse treatment, inpatient substance abuse treatment, and others I couldn't because the beds weren't available. That's a natural experiment. You have a counterfactual. And now you can study those two cases and similar cases that match on their backgrounds, but because the real world doesn't always present the opportunity to have those combination of treatments or in the same dosages, right? I couldn't get the COVID two shot version, the Moderna. I got the Johnson & Johnson. Those are natural experiments, okay? So that's what we mean by natural experiments. Machine learning makes it now possible to study all those patterns of differences, not just one variable, but a combination and how they interact. That's the power of the technology, okay? So that's the back end, and we had to get the analytics right. We were leading with that, and that was version 1, Erica. Then we got to a place and we started realizing utilization is the most important metric of success. Practitioner utilization. And that's when we started realizing we might care very much about that back end, and it has to make sense because, believe it or not, the practitioners will know if it's valid. If information comes out and they're like, that's not the way it really happens, then we would know our analytics were wrong, even if they weren't in the engine. Right. Okay. So we had to get that right for sure. But the other element of the design is we had to implement human-centered design. And so we really learned, I mean, we actually partnered on a project with IDEO. We really practiced, learned a lot about just human-centered design approaches because we realized that practitioners have to use this. And in order to use it, that's when you get the real learning and you get everything else done. So I know we're running short on time, so I'll stop there. But essentially, those are some of the key components that I'll add to what you were saying, Erica.
No, Pete, that's great, Pete and Erica, and you're sort of anticipating my next question for you, which is I'm curious with a little bit of the look back when you look at the project to date, and then I'll look forward. Which elements, maybe one or two aspects, just because we are a bit tight on time here, which aspects of the actual evidence framework have played out in the past, and where do you anticipate they might play out in the future as you are building on this capability in this work?
This was a hard question for me to answer because I feel like all of them do. and maybe that's why we're here on this call today, is to really kind of dive into that a little bit more, because I do think that this is a great example of the framework in action. I think, as someone who has been trained as a clinician first and has had a real passion around culturally developing and executing services in a way that's culturally responsive and humble, I think, and also being aware of systemic and structural inequities and the conditions that create that, the structural conditions, the mental models, that sort of thing. I think for me, this tool, it was developed with a lens on equity, but I also think it speaks to what you were saying, Pete. It's like one size does not fit all, right? Extended foster care is a universal policy. Everyone gets the same thing. And while we, in tandem, work to change that and advocate for a different system, for the child welfare system to begin to actually create a continuum of care that supports young people wherever they're at for as long as they need to achieve the same goals, that is something that we're trying to create in our own organization, right? So that doing whatever it takes to get to the same outcome for a young person who has a very different baseline than another young person is the goal. And I think this is our way of engaging in that, I say this all the time, a targeted universalistic approach to executing extended foster care. And then field building around elevating the discourse around the importance of employment and education and the responsibility of the child welfare system in really embracing the values it espouses to support young people to become self-sufficient through investments in these areas and lifting up the learnings to help do that, right? So we're putting this information, everything that we're learning from the YRT, we're applying internally. We just did an equity analysis using Youth Roadmap tool data. And all of that data now is being used by our leadership along with our director of practice development and culture, the awesome Deandra Jones, to be able to incorporate what we learn into a strategy for eliminating and addressing racial and ethnic disparities and getting what works. So that to me definitely resonates. And I also think, the other one is around building practitioner capacity for R&D. I think that to me has been one of the biggest wins of this whole process. We're about to, we just launched maybe a year ago, our apprenticeship model, which is a much more robust and rigorous youth identified type of education to employment model, so that we build more power in what we do so that we can help young people get to that living wage employment. And we're using, and the goal is to have them exit with living wage jobs, right? So we're using the Youth Roadmap tool. Everyone in program is using the Youth Roadmap tool to test different elements of the apprenticeship model over time. And we have kind of like a built-in comparison and treatment kind of conditions that you would think about in traditional research, but we get to do it in real time, give it back to people. So those are the two I think that really resonate for me the most. And we're doing communities of practice, which we're going to do Youth Roadmap tool communities of practice. So peers need to learn from peers.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Nothing like helping to build each other's capacity.
Yeah.
So I appreciate where Eric is coming from. I think the one thing that I would say, so I'm gonna flip it around and go, where do I think we still need? Because I think it checks most of the boxes in my, and I'm concurring with Erica. The one thing that I think I'd like to see, if we really want to get to that place of equity, true equity, it's how do we bring in more of the voices of the community and the voices of the youth themselves and interacting with the tool so that it's their tool too. It's not just practitioners. And so I think that's evolving already. I know the motivation and drive is there, and I think there's some beginning kind of experimentation and trying things at First Place for Youth. And I know the desire, and you can hear it, Erica's affirmation as well, that's where it's going. But I think that ultimately that would round this out to kind of check the boxes of the framework that I think is the precisely right framework. That framework to me resonates so well in terms of what this is striving to do. And it's because I think it's bringing these worlds together and meeting at the space where the practitioner meets the youth.
That's right.
And I think if we can get to the youth, I think we'll have rounded it out.
And that is a next step. Yeah, thank you for lifting that, Pete, because we really do want to develop a youth dashboard for youth, right? We are encouraging staff to use this with young people, but we also want young people to be empowered to use it for themselves and design it themselves. So I think that is absolutely one thing. And we've gotten input from young people on the design of the practitioner one, but it's not enough, right? We need to kind of go to that next step. So thanks, Pete, I agree.
A quick question for both of you under the topic of decision-making. There's a few questions in chat. And curious, I think, Erica, with the dashboard, to understand what types of decisions and maybe new and different decisions you see your team making now that they have this data, or how the quality of decision-making has shifted or changed. And then maybe a little bit, any comment on tensions between what the data is saying and what human judgment is saying with case managers?
Hello, yes. Well, that's always something.
Yes.
I'll answer that one first, because I think that's another, I mean, there are always going to, and we could have a whole other webinar about change management and identifying, extreme users of all, of technology. But, I think we have always bumped up against the question of this is not a tool. And we say this all the time. This is not a tool that replaces your relationship with your young person and your judgment as a practitioner at all. It is something that is a support, an additional tool in your toolkit. And it's actually a tool that gives you access to other tools, because you click on those. I didn't say this before, but you click on those high impact services and high impact goals, and it takes you to a customized toolkit of things you could do with a young person. So it really is intended to expand the range of resources available to practitioners for them to pick and choose from. And I think we, again, this was something that I realized, I'm like, we didn't do this sufficiently before, but we did. I feel like we're doing it right now. Is the practitioners tell us how they want to use it, and we make that how it goes, right? We started off with these grand visions of like, we'll use it for making determinations about readiness to exit, and maybe that will happen, right? Like, how do you begin to transition a young person? Or maybe if a young person needs a longer runway in the program, maybe we earmark, them, if they want to stay with us longer, we make sure that we have a bed that's available past 21 using one of our other contracts. Like, that is something that is in the works and we continue to talk about, but it's really those day-to-day decisions and conversations with young people where I think the tool is really most helpful, and in conversations around your plan. Like, how do you want to drive your plan? What could this look like, right? Where are you having successes? I think, where is it that you might want to develop? Because half of your caseload has this one need, right? So the conversations and supervision about how managers support staff to basically optimize across their caseload what the needs of young people are in their own development and support, I think is a big piece of this. And then, I learned recently from Matt that our managers are using the Youth Roadmap tool as a great way to onboard new staff, because it's a really cool and digestible entree into the My First Place program model in a way that's like, oh, okay, you don't have to do, like, here are the essential things that you do. So, those are some of the ways that, there's a ton of ways that people are using it to, like, one of the staff people was using it to help their young person develop their self-efficacy prior to entering a new job, or their grit, right, which is a big predictor in the modeling of success. So there's a number of different stories, but there's a lot of good stories.
I'll give you a very few seconds because I know we're running short on time. But what I would piggyback on this is say, at BCT, we have this philosophy that when we're putting this stuff together, everything is probabilities. Okay, so part of the challenge with predictive analytics and other types of recommender engines and things is that they don't transparently share with the decision maker what it really means. What it really means is, in 60% of the cases in history, we succeed, in 40% we don't if you do this. If not, it's a 50-50. And so at some point, the point being is that you have to empower people. It's kind of like doctors. They get a lot of laboratory stuff. It says things are within normal ranges, but the doctors, in their wisdom, experience, education, they make that final decision. So our mantra is we provide what the data says transparently. These are the odds in history of how things worked. Okay, it's not about decisions. There are a lot of predictive analytics in the private sector that would be like, don't make the loan, make the loan, and they don't let the people with the experience of working with potential business owners, and we see some of the challenges with that, right? But in fact, it's all probabilities. And so what we have to be is transparent and respect that, because that's where the power of their experience and wisdom comes in. And there's no way the data is going to give us all of that.
Pete, thank you so much for that. And Erica, thank you so much for your words of wisdom and sharing your journey with you. It is an impressive one and an exciting one, and we all look forward to the continuance and the road ahead. My colleague Laura is going to pop a link in the chat for everyone, the brief survey. If we might ask you to indulge us with the provision of some data. We have links to the study, to the case study, to the actual evidence framework. And I know there were some other specific questions regarding the work, regarding topics on kind of the data quality and whatnot, and we can gather some of those and make sure that we get responses to folks. One piece that I would just, in addition, with a tremendous note of gratitude for you all attending, for Eric and Pete, for the PE team pulling us together, Rebecca Maynard, who's a big part of this project, not able to join us today, and that support from the Gates Foundation. Recent conversation with Pete and Erica, and we were talking about the importance of the arrows. It's all about the arrows in the logic model. And it is all about fidelity to those arrows, and then fidelity of the data collection to those arrows and what we do with that. And the more that we can support better judgment through transparency in the name of, I think, building more actionable evidence because we are aligned on the outcomes we want. I think this offers us a lot of optimism and hope ahead for next generation evidence building, but for our ability to collectively pool our expertise, our commitments and energies, and make things better for the students and communities that we serve. So with that, a tremendous note of thank you to you all. We're planning more webinars in 2022 and hope that everyone has a wonderful holiday season before then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.